Greetings, comrades! The idea of the Soviet Communist Society can be easily described by the phrase "everything in the country is common, so everything in the country is mine." Perhaps in the ideal world this was indeed the idea. All the vast expanse of the USSR and all the riches of its subsoil should have belonged equally to all its citizens. And if one were to look for the most vivid example of this collective Soviet way of life, it is of course the kolkhozes, especially their early iteration. In theory, these were voluntary associations of farmers who formed a cooperative with others of the same kind. These collective worked together in the fields throughout the year, and each person received his fair share after the harvest, depending on the days worked. In theory, it sounds good for a simple peasant. It is really more efficient to work together. Everyone is personally interested in high labor productivity. People are in absolutely equal conditions. What happened in practice? Why did the USSR government have to literally force people to join collective farms, sometimes even using repressive methods? First, I want to clarify, I will be talking about the phenomenon of collectivization itself and about kolkhozes of the early USSR. The world has changed after the Second World War, and the realities of life in the Soviet Union gradually changed with it. If you want to know about the life of collective farms in the late USSR, let me know in the comments. Secondly, terminology. Collectivization is a policy of uniting small peasant land holdings into collective farms, kolkhozes and sovkhozes, for the sake of improving the efficiency of the agricultural sector. I think the words kolkhoz and sovkhoz are about equally incomprehensible to Westerners. I'll explain. Kolkhoz is short for коллективное хозяйство, collective farm, and sovkhoz is советское хозяйство, Soviet farm. Kolkhozes were cooperatives created by the peasants themselves, while sovkhozes were large state-owned enterprises. That is, conventionally speaking, a sovkhoz is kolkhoz 2.0, an ideal version of a collective farm. In the early USSR there were very few of them, and they were created on the basis of pre-revolutionary horse farms and landowner estates. And kolkhoz is some intermediate form of transition from the ideologically harmful concept of family farm and individual land holdings to the state planning of all spheres of life. Yes, we're talking about the USSR, so as you understand, although formally kolkhozes were cooperatives, in fact they were still fully controlled by the state. Let's think of these two types of farms as factories. Sovkhoz is a huge state-owned enterprise. You come to work for an 8-hour shift, then go home, and the factory pays you money for your work. Kolkhoz was a kind of your own factory, which you and your neighbors built with your own money in your backyard. You brought some machines from home so the factory could work, but you could not make any important decisions about its operation. You could not take these machines back home, and you could not stop working at the factory yourself. Oh yes, and you could sell the gears made at this factory only to the state at strictly set prices. In return, the state will give some of the gears back to you, and sometimes pay you a little extra. Interesting, huh? I must admit that I exaggerated a bit in the previous part, if only because collectivization of agriculture was not an invention of the Soviet Union. About 6,000 agricultural societies did exist in Russia even before the revolution. Besides, even though living conditions in the early USSR kolkhozes look almost slave-like nowadays, in fact they were not as outrageous as one might think. Until the middle of the 19th century, most peasants in Russia were serfs, and accordingly had slightly more rights than a slave. In the next 50 years their living conditions changed, but did they improve much? Peasants themselves became free, but all the land remained with the landlords, and it was necessary to pay for it constantly or to buy it out. And the terms of buying out were often frankly predatory. So yes, peasants in Russia were no longer sold and bought like animals, but they often lived in hunger, intensively moving from villages to cities for any work. And when the Bolsheviks nationalized all the land and handed it over to the people, many people took it positively. Or at least neutrally. Once an acquaintance of mine recalled the words of his great-grandmother, who had lived all her life in a remote village in Udmurtia. The best year of our lives was 1918. At that time the Tsar was not taking all the crops from us anymore. and the Bolsheviks were not taking all the crops from us yet. In other words, we cannot say that bad Lenin came and made living in villages a living hell. No, 90% of the population of villages lived badly under Tsarist Russia and not much better under Soviet Russia. Immediately after the revolution, peasants actually began to organize themselves into collective farms. There was the influence of party propaganda, it was easier to survive together, and most importantly, in their nature, collective farms were very similar to traditional Russian peasant communities, общиnas. In the first 10 years of Soviet life, kolkhozes were a relatively voluntary affair. The Soviet state wanted to achieve the proverbial communism in all spheres of life, but did not rush and coerce people too much. People could even choose which form of collective activity to organize. It was possible to share only complex machines, leaving everything else privately owned. You could share land, equipment and livestock, but keep your house and a small plot of land in private ownership. Or you could organize a full-fledged commune, where you didn't even own your own houses, but shared everything, up to the organization of catering. It all changed in 1927. There was the so-called bread strike, when rural producers began to refuse en masse to sell bread to the cities due to fear of imminent war with the British Empire and Poland. Plus, there were rumors that the peasants were going to form their own party in opposition to the Workers' Party of the Old Union Communist Party, to protect the interest of the village. The country found itself in a sudden food crisis, and that was during the good harvest year, and the anti-urban and anti-communist sentiments of the rural population were also growing. Authorities chose the most radical methods of solving this problem. Over the next 10 years, 93% of peasant households were collectivized. It is funny, but in the same year of 1927, the CEC and CPC of the USSR issued a decree on collective farms, which established the voluntary nature of peasants' membership in these very collective farms. That is, in the first 10 years, peasants were not very eager to unite into collective farms, but when the decree on voluntary unification into collective farms was issued, then everyone rushed to unite. In fact, the Soviet state had several goals for the rapid advancement of collectivization. The first official one was to implement socialist transformation in the countryside and to eliminate the division of peasants according to wealth. All Soviet citizens must live in equality. The second was to ensure uninterrupted supply of food to the rapidly growing cities during industrialization. Cities were growing by leaps and bounds, which meant they needed more food than before. And the events of 1927-1928 showed that the peasants were not always ready to supply the required amount of products uninterruptedly, even when conditions were favorable. The third reason was the release of manpower from the village for large construction projects. Up to 80% of the country's able-bodied population was concentrated in the village at that time. Collectivization allowed replacing manual labor with machine labor, and free people were to be transferred to the construction of cities, hydroelectric power plants, canals, factories and other critical facilities. Finally, if you optimize production and improve labor productivity, you can get more grain, export the surplus and use the money to buy equipment for the same industrialization. The state had no other source of foreign currency at that time. Again, in theory, everything is logical. Small peasant farms were not able to quickly increase their productivity because they were limited by a higher degree of manual labor, and they could not afford modern agricultural machinery. Therefore, it was necessary to consolidate them, provide them with the necessary equipment, and as a result the country would be uninterruptedly supplied with food and agricultural resources for trade. In practice, however, all this was done so quickly, so rashly, and with such harsh methods that it led to tragedy. The transition to a policy of forced collectivization occurred in 1929, when the government finally realized that the soft methods of pumping funds from the countryside to industry were not working as they would have liked. In November 1929, Stalin's article Year of the Great Turn was published. It spoke of a radical change in the development of our agriculture, from small and backward individual farming to large and advanced collective farming, and also about the measures of assistance of the state to kolkhoz construction. So, what was this assistance? 25,000 workers from the cities were mobilized to carry out collectivization, ready to obey party directives without question. Evasion of collectivization was treated as a crime, and peasants were forced to join kolkhozes under the threat of closure of their local markets and churches. The property of those who dared to resist collectivization was confiscated. The assistance was effective. By the end of February 1930, there were already 14 million households in collective farms, 60% of the total number. What did this 3-month collectivization look like? A party assistant with a couple of armed commissars would come from the city to the village and announce that from now on everything peasants of the village owned will be common. Here's a barn where you will store the machinery with which you will cultivate the fields, and here's another barn your cows, sheep, geese and chickens will live. How to quickly organize their feeding in winter? We'll decide later, bring them all here. As a result, in some places most of the animals died after the first few days of such collectivization. And some peasants simply slaughtered all their cattle, not wanting to give them up to death. Of course, this was not the case everywhere, but as a result of these rapid reforms, the USSR livestock industry was dealt a huge blow. The number of horses in the village in 1933 decreased by half in comparison with 1928, cattle and pigs by more than 40%, small cattle by 60%. Now let's move on to the famous Dekulakization. Those farmers whose private farms were successful enough saw what such forced collectivization leads to, and naturally did not want to participate in it. They were doing fine as it was. Kulaks did not want to surrender their grain, livestock, equipment, and actively opposed the government. As a result, after the fall of 1930, dekulakization was elevated to the rank of state policy. But how can one determine who exactly is a kulak? The then accepted division into poor, mid-income and kulaks was very arbitrary. In some areas, those who had 2 cows, or 2 horses, or just a good sturdy house were considered kulaks. Local JSPDs and authorities, with the participation of village activists, were responsible for compiling lists of families to be subjected to dekulakization. Did your neighbor spit in your well once? Hint to the authorities that he is burying grain in his backyard. And then, in the best case, he will be evicted outside your settlement. In the worst case, he will be forcibly sent to Siberia to the construction sites of communism. That is, to fell timber or build hydroelectric power plants alongside the prisoners of the gulags. Or maybe he'll just get shot. All property would be seized and distributed between the collective farm and the poor. Sounds like a nice plan. In general, in such conditions, collectivization went like clockwork. There were very few people willing to go to Siberia instead of continuing life in their native village. Although not without protests. Peasants slaughtered cattle, damaged collective farm machines, and regular units of the Red Army were even thrown in to subdue the protests in Ukraine and Caucasian republics. There were numerous cases of murders of 25,000ers. These were workers' activists who had come to organize this collectivization in the villages. As a result, the Soviet Union was forced to backtrack a little and slightly soften the conditions of collectivization. But the damage to agriculture had already been done. And the terrible famine of 1932-1933 was a direct result of this very policy. Ukraine, the North Caucasus, Kazakhstan, the Volga region. According to some estimates, the famine in these areas claimed the lives of more than 5 million people. Among the reasons, we should highlight not collectivization itself, but the program of food requisitioning and the fanatical commitment of the Soviet authorities to the execution of the plan. The harvests in 1931 and 1932 were below average, understandable right after the stress of rapid forced collectivization, and as a result there was a real threat that the pace of industrialization would have to be slowed down, because the established scheme of selling grain, receiving currency, buying machine tools would be disrupted. Between imported machines and people's lives, the USSR leadership chose the former. Special commissions were sent to villages to literally seize the last grain from the population, even that which was intended for sowing in the spring. As a result, a paradoxical situation arose when the worst famine occurred in those areas of the country which were the most fertile. And the sacred industrialization had to be slowed down anyway, but from the fall of 1933. As a result, even after the brutal dekulakization was stopped, peasants had no choice but to accept work in kolkhozes. The entire policy of the Soviet leadership with regard to agriculture was aimed at keeping the peasant with strict limits: either work in the collective farm or go to the city and join the new proletariat. Don't want to? Well, you can go to the forest and eat bark there, that's also an option. By 1932, so many people were fleeing the villages for the cities that the authorities began looking for a way to stop it, especially since they had quite welcomed it before. And they found a way. In December 1932, passports and the propiska system were introduced in the USSR. You could not move to the city and get a job there without a passport. Guess which category of citizens did not receive passports until the 1960s? That's right, kolkhoz workers. One could leave the collective farm only with the permission of the chairman, and only for a good reason. You could do it without breaking the law only in two cases: if you were drafted into the army or sent to some grand construction site of industrialization. But people get used to everything, and they got used to this. The poor peasants by and large had nothing to lose. The mid-income ones were afraid to stick their necks out and protest, as they did not want to meet the same fate as the kulaks. And the latter had already been sent into exile or to the better world. Besides, after all, the USSR had not only the stick, but also the carrot in its hands. Collective farms were provided with interest-free loans, they were supplied with agricultural machinery and tools, they were given tax benefits. Gradually, the farms got back on their feet and began to produce the food that the state demanded from them, and their standard of living became more or less acceptable. As I said, although the Soviet regime broke one of the foundations of peasant life, the individual farm, it kept up other traditions: the communal spirit of the Russian village, interdependence, and joint labor, however without any independence. Formerly, the kolkhozes were managed on the basis of self-government. The general meeting of collective farmers elected a chairman, a management board, and an audit commission. In fact, collective farms were run by district party committees, which strictly controlled the lives of ordinary peasants. Kolkhoz inhabitants worked for so-called labor days, a mark for going to work. For these labor days, they also received a part of the products produced by the collective farm. They were usually allowed to keep a tiny piece of land near their houses too. Of course, one could not dream of prosperity, but in general life became stable. So, is it possible to say something good about the collectivization carried out in the country? Strangely enough, yes. Collectivization as a whole solved the problem of transfer of funds and labor from the agricultural sector to industry, ensured the supply of agricultural products to the army and industrial centers, and provided the USSR with much-needed foreign currency. By the mid-1930s, the country was annually harvesting almost twice as much marketable grain as before collectivization. Kolkhozes managed to adequately feed the growing population of the state, especially the cities. The organization of large farms and the introduction of machine technology made it possible to remove a gigantic number of people from agriculture, people who worked on the construction sites of industrialization, then fought in the war against Nazism and raised industry again in the post-war years. A huge part of human and material resources was transferred from the countryside, thanks to which the country eventually made the desired industrial leap. Was it worth it? From the state's point of view, yes, of course. From the people's point of view, you decide. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Stick221, Steven, Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berze, Jordan Lamott, Jimmy Albin, Eli, and Petr Ilic. See you guys next time.